So yes, hello everyone. Today's topic for discussion is the evolution of central and provincial structure, and we will also be seeing the various governor generals which came to govern India during this period of time. So let's see. Now, when Britishers started running the administration of India, first of all, they had an bird eye view. Also, they looked upon the administration from the bottom down approach. There was no, the approach was top to bottom. There was no down to up approach. So their major focus was on the important centers in the important provincial headquarters rather than focusing on the uh, other hinterland areas. So the central governments we talk about. So the Act of Better Government of India, that is in 1858, this marked a significant shift in the authority, transferring governance from East India Company to the Crown. The company's incapacity to effectively administer the country was proven through the revolt of 1857, and this also showcased the lack of accountability which led to the change, because after the 1857 revolt, the East India Company was not holding its officials accountable for whatever the reaction came from the Indians, so which led, because we have seen by 1858 the territories of the East India Company were now under the British possession. So somewhere when this reaction came into being, this was seen due to the ill policies or the bad governance of the Britishers, not the East India Company. So, East India Company was not at all accountable for this thing. The whole accountability went to the Crown. So the Crown decided that if they are accountable, then let's now govern the administer the areas of the India. So under the new arrangement, the governance was to be conducted through a Secretary of State and member of British cabinet assisted by 15 members. So a Secretary of State will be there, who will be stationed in Britain, and with him a council of 15 members will be there who will look after the India's happening. The Secretary of State was directly accountable to the British Parliament. He will have to report to the British Parliament. These reports will be laid on the floor of British Parliament and held sole authority over initiatives and final decisions, rendering the council purely advisory. The role of the council was advisory in nature. They can only give advice. They cannot make any rules and laws, which will be made by the British Parliament only. Consequently, the dual system established by Pitt's India ceased to exist, with ultimate authority resting with the Parliament of the Britain. The governance of India continued under the Governor Generals, whose stature, if not authority, was elevated with the new title of Viceroy. Just the title got changed to the Viceroy. Assisting the Viceroy was an executive council comprising members who served as department heads and official advisors to the Viceroy. As we have discussed, the portfolio system was there after 1861 Act. Also, there were multiple official advisors who advises Viceroy on the governance, on the ruling, on the administration of the executives. However, the concentration of the primary authority in the hands of the Secretary of the State based in London gradually dismissed the Viceroy's autonomy. So, the Viceroy's superior or the Viceroy need to report to the Secretary of State. So, Secretary of State became more important post rather than the Viceroy, and he exacerbated the disconnect between Indian public opinion and the government policy making. He was sitting at British. So he was not knowing the ground reality. The British Secretary of State not at all knowing the ground reality. So he had that disconnect from the India and Indian public opinions. This centralization also boosted the influence of British industrialists, merchants and bankers on Indian government policies, resulting in more reactionary administration than before 1858. So the centralization of policies which were started with 1858, that each and everything will be controlled from Secretary of State, who will ultimately report to the British Parliament. So there was a centralized system. There was a hierarchy where Parliament, sorry, let me change the color. So where the Parliament will be there, over Parliament also one thing, that is Crown. Below Parliament there will be Secretary of State. Secretary of State will be seated at Britain, or you can say London. He will be having council of 15 members, and under him will be Viceroy. So this Viceroy had to report to Secretary of State. Secretary of State will be reporting to Parliament and thus the Crown. So there was a centralized system, there was a centralized hierarchy where decentralization was not at all there. The provinces was not getting any actual power. Under the Indian Council Act of 1861, a fifth member, typically a jurist, was incorporated into Viceroy's Executive Council for legislative purposes. The Viceroy had the authority to appoint 6 to 12 additional members. So the legislative process became more deliberate. It became more uh, process bound, at least half of whom had to be non-officials, either Indian or English. So there were efforts to include the native Indians also in the advisory role of the Legislative Council. So the role will be advisory. They cannot make any laws, they cannot make any rules. They can just advise the Viceroy. The veto was still with the Viceroy. However, the Legislative Council formed under this Act lacked substantive power, served primarily in an advisory capacity. The limitations of this advisory council was it was unable to deliberate on significant matters, any financial issues. The council had no authority over the budget. The discussion regarding executive actions were not permitted. You cannot debate if there had been any executive actions and which led to the bad governance. You cannot debate that executive actions at all. The final approval of the bills required the Viceroy's consent, even if it endorsed by Viceroy, the Secretary of State could veto legislation. So the final veto was with Secretary of State. And now just remember, if you just can rethink about this thing, that Viceroy was still in India, so he might have some ground reality about the Indians, about what is going on in India. So he might have given some assent to some bills which are beneficial for Indians. However, when he will send those bills to Secretary of State, or when Secretary of State sees these bills, and if he sees that these bills or these acts are not on the parallel line uh, with his point